What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be going over our low life bulwark Stormclaw build now that we have finally gotten our hands on the Tears of Blood Glyph and incorporated it into our Paragon board and done some testing inside the Abattoir of Zur. So we have made quite a few changes to this build overall, including a lot of changes to the gear affixes as well as a big change to the Paragon board to accommodate that Tears of Blood Glyph. But we have seen a massive boost to our damage overall as well as our survivability for doing higher tier Abattoir of Zur. Also, a link to this build will be down in the description below, as well as a link to the previous version of this build without the Tears of Blood Glyph that I used to clear the first tier of Abattoir of Zur, just in case you're coming across this video and you haven't quite reached the end game just yet. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and go over the build. So for our sign skills, we're using Claw, Poison Creeper, Earthen Bulwark, Hurricane, and Petrify for our ultimate. And for our spirit boons, we're using Weariness on the Deer, we're spirit bonded into the Eagle, and we're picking up Scythe Talents as well as Avian Wrath. And on the Wolf, we're using Pack Leader to reset our Poison Creeper. And finally, on the Snake, we're using Overload. Now, you can swap Overload into Calm Before the Storm if that's what you would prefer, but I just personally like Overload. Now, for our equipment pieces, we're running the Harlequin Crest on the helmet. Now, I personally do not have a Harlequin Crest. However, this would be the best in slot helmet for this build, in my opinion. If you don't have one yourself, you can go ahead and get away with a Tempest Roar or a Godslayer crown like I do. However, if you do like to run a normal helmet, I will have affixes in the gear stats, and for the aspect, I would probably go with the aspect of Might, as it gives you a nice chunk of damage reduction from your basic attacks. For the chest, we're using the Symbiotic aspect, as this is a Nature's Fury build, so we like that cooldown to our non-ultimate skills from this aspect. For our gloves, we're running the Conceited aspect to buff up our damage while we have a barrier, and we always have a barrier as this is a low-life bulwark build. For the pants, we're running the aspect of Mending Stone to increase the duration of our bulwark. And for the boots, we're using the Ghostwalker aspect to give us a nice chunk of movement speed as well as allow us to move through enemies freely while we're unstoppable, and we'll always be unstoppable because we have Bulwark and we also have Metamorphosis. For the only unique you definitely need for this build, because it is a Stormclaw build, we're using Great Staff of the Crone. For our amulet, we're using the Rapid aspect to increase the speed of our basic attacks. For the first ring, we're running Overcharge aspect, and for the second ring, we're running the Runeworker's Conduit aspect, because both of these aspects do a ton of damage and are the backbone of this build overall. Now for our gear stats, on the helmet, if you are running a normal helmet, I would prefer cooldown reduction, total armor, willpower, and lucky hit chance while you have a barrier. For the chest, we're looking for total armor, ranks of Earthen Bulwark, which you definitely need for this build, damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, and damage reduction while fortified. For the gloves, we are looking for crit strike chance, attack speed, and lucky hit chance. I feel like those three affixes are a must. The fourth I prefer is willpower. However, you can go ahead and flex that if you'd like to. For the pants, I like damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, total armor, damage reduction while injured, and damage reduction while fortified. And for the boots, I like to go ahead and use total armor while in werewolf form, movement speed, damage reduction while injured, and shrine buff duration, as shrines are a massive source of survivability and damage when you're pushing those higher tiers of the Abattoir of Zur. For the amulet, let's go with total armor while in werewolf form, movement speed, damage reduction while injured, and ranks of the Envenom passive. And for our rings, we are running crit strike chance, lucky hit chance, damage to close enemies, as well as critical strike damage. Now, you can flex the critical strike damage slots here on your rings for damage to distant enemies if you want to buff up the Thunderstruck node in your Paragon board. Moving on to our gems, we're using sapphires on the weapon. However, you can also use emeralds if you'd like. We're using amethysts on the armor pieces, as I really like that damage reduction from damage over time effects, which seems to be insanely powerful, especially in the Abattoir of Zur. So I really feel like I get a lot of survivability out of these. If you would like, you can also use sapphires or you can use rubies. And for the jewelry, we are using diamonds for the resistance to all elements. However, the Paragon board will give you enough resistances that you can take some of these diamonds out and replace them with skulls if you are missing some armor to reach armor cap for the higher tiers of Abattoir of Zur. Now for our vampiric powers, we're using Domination to get that nice chunk of multiplicative damage towards enemies that are stunned, immobilized, frozen, or feared. Then we're using Sanguine Brace to go ahead and buff up our crit strike chance while we're fortified. For the next two, we're using Ravenous and Moonrise because we're trying to increase our attack speed as much as possible with this build. And then for our last Vampiric power, we're using Metamorphosis for the nice change to evade that allows us to move over the top of walls as well as packs of enemies. And it's a nice secondary option to provide us unstoppable. Also, down in build details, I do have a written out explanation how to achieve low life bulwark so that way you can get that big damage reduction while you have a barrier. And also, I do have it written out here that if you do not have all 3 rolls of damage reduction while injured on your affixes, you can go ahead and swap out one of your Vampiric powers for the Vampiric power resilience just to give yourself that extra damage reduction until you get the proper rolls on your gear. But let's go ahead and move on to the skills of the build. Now moving on to our skills, we're just going to go over these pretty quickly as nothing has really changed from the previous version of this build. So we're picking up 5 points in Claw and moving into Wild Claw, then 5 points in Storm Strike and moving into Fierce Storm Strike. Then we're grabbing 3 points in Predatory Instinct and then 2 points in Digigrade Gate just to increase our movement speed a little bit. Then we are going to pick up 5 points in Earthen Bulwark, and this is a must 5 points as this is a low life bulwark build. And then we're going into Preserving Earthen Bulwark as this will be our primary source of Fortify. Then we're picking up 1 point Ancestral Fortitude and then 3 points Vigilance for that damage reduction after using a defensive skill. And we'll always have that buff available because we are spamming Earthen Bulwark. Then for our companions, we're going Poison Creeper into Brutal Poison Creeper, so we have that nice increase to our critical strike chance while we are attacking enemies under the effect of our active Poison Creeper skill. Then for our Wrath skills, we're going into the Storm Tree passives here. We're grabbing 1 point Elemental Exposure, 1 point Charged Atmosphere, 3 points Electric Shock, and then 3 points Bad Omen. We're also picking up 1 point into Hurricane and moving into Savage Hurricane, so we have that damage reduction while we have our Hurricane up. Then we're grabbing 1 point Neurotoxin, 1 point Toxic Claws, and then 3 points in Venom. Moving into our ultimate skills, we're using Petrify, and then we're putting 1 point into Prime Petrify to increase the duration. And then we're also picking up 3 points in Defiance to give us some multiplicative damage towards elites, as well as 3 points into Natural Disaster, so we can get some multiplicative damage towards enemies that are stunned, immobilized, or knocked back. And then for our key passive, we are going with Nature's Fury. Now for the most important part of the video, the Paragon board. And for the first board, we're still running the Earth and Sky Glyph, and we are going to pick up a few magic notes here and there as we leave out of the board. And then for our second board, we are using the Height and Malice board still, and this is where I decided to socket in the Tears of Blood Glyph. So I went ahead and still trailed off here and picked up the Height and Malice legendary note as it is insanely useful for doing Abattoir of Zur. But for the Tears of Blood Glyph, I like this board because it has a ton of stats around the Tears of Blood Glyph, as well as a nice synergy with the rare nodes as the damage reduction from poison enemies, as well as the damage to poison enemies is going to synergize really well with our build. Now, I will say not all of these stat nodes will be useful when you first get your Tears of Blood Glyph, so you can go ahead and pull some of these points that aren't being utilized by the Tears of Blood Glyph and socket them elsewhere to increase your damage or survivability, whatever you may need, and then pull them out when you finally level up your Tears of Blood Glyph to access all of the stat nodes that it can. Moving into our third board, we are using the Constricting Tendrils board, and I did go ahead and remove the Werewolf Glyph from the previous build and socket the Fang and Claw Glyph here. Then for our fourth board, we're using the Thunderstruck board still, and then I still have my Electrocution Glyph here as well, because I really like that glyph, not just for the multiplicative damage, but it does increase the damage of our aspects as well. Then for our fifth board, we're using the Earth and Devastation board, as well as the Spirit Glyph still. And then for our final board, we're using the Ancestral Guidance board and the Territorial Glyph still. But that's really it, guys. That's all the changes I've made to the build overall when I finally got my hands on the Tears of Blood Glyph and was able to do some of the tiers of Abattoir of Zur. I still have quite a few tiers I can push into and quite a lot of damage and damage reduction left on the table, as I do not have all of the optimized pieces for this build. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. I've been having a great time reading you guys' comments and then responding to them, and honestly, it's probably the most fun I have when it comes to making these videos. But that's really it, guys. I hope you guys are having a great day and a great night, depending on wherever you're from, and peace out. I will see you in the next one.